The world's eyes are locked on Gaza and Ukraine. But quietly, far from the cameras, something extraordinary is unfolding across the African continent, not a war, not a protest, but a revolution of code. In the heart of Eastern and Southern Africa, 21 nations have come together under a single idea. What if we could trade without the dollar? What if Africa could finally buy, sell, and prosper in its own currencies on its own terms? This isn't science fiction. It's called the COMESA Digital Payment System, and it's already being tested between Malawi and Zambia. For the first time, African nations are settling cross-border payments without converting to US dollars, a quiet act of defiance against a financial order that has lasted for generations. Kenya's trade minister called it a game changer. President William Ruto, now chairing COMESA, says it's the dawn of a new era of integration and independence. But in Washington, the tone is very different. President Donald Trump has warned nations not to walk away from the American currency, hinting at retaliation. So what's really at stake here? This isn't just about money. It's about freedom, the kind that once required armies and now requires algorithms. It's about whether Africa can finally stand on its own economic feet, or whether the weight of the dollar will pull it back again. Because when a continent starts trading in its own currencies, it's not just a financial change. It's a shift in power, a quiet digital rebellion. Do you think Africa can truly break free from the dollar's grip? If you believe that sovereignty begins with economic freedom, stay with us. And please share this video if you're one of the few who still believe that truth and dignity matter more than the headlines. It began as most revolutions do, quietly. No marching crowds, no gunfire. Just a simple announcement from a conference hall in Lusaka that Africa was taking its first digital step toward independence. The Common Market for Eastern and Southern Africa, or COMESA, had just unveiled a platform that could rewrite the rules of trade on the continent. The system is called the Regional Digital Payment Platform, and its mission is as bold as it is simple: to allow African nations to trade directly with one another in their own local currencies without ever touching the US dollar. For decades, even when two African neighbors like Zambia and Malawi traded with each other, their payments had to travel halfway across the world, first converted into dollars in New York or London, then back again. The result? Lost time, lost money, lost sovereignty. Every transaction, no matter how small, carried a hidden tax of dependency. Now that system is being dismantled. With this new platform, COMESA's 21 member states, from Kenya to Zimbabwe, from Djibouti to the Democratic Republic of Congo, can settle payments instantly and securely through a digital interface designed entirely in Africa. The system is being rolled out in partnership with two digital financial service providers and a regional forex operator, though their identities are still being kept under wraps for security reasons. The trial phase launched between Malawi and Zambia is already making headlines. Local businesses that once spent up to 30% of their profit margins just to move money across borders are now paying less than 3% in transaction costs. For small and medium enterprises, which make up over 80% of Africa's businesses and 60% of its employment, that difference means survival and growth. Kenya's trade minister was one of the first to speak publicly about it. On social media, he hailed the system as a game changer for African entrepreneurs, calling it a tool that could finally put small business owners on equal footing with international corporations. For years, these entrepreneurs had been the invisible engine of African economies, working tirelessly, but trapped by outdated, expensive, and insecure banking systems inherited from the colonial past. President William Ruto of Kenya, who recently assumed the chairmanship of COMESA, framed the launch as part of a broader vision, a vision where Africa doesn't just produce raw materials for the world, but builds its own value chains powered by local innovation and digital infrastructure. His message was clear: true independence begins when Africans can trade freely among themselves. Across Africa, reactions have been electric. In Lusaka, shop owners gathered around their phones watching the announcement live-streamed online. In Lilongwe, a group of young fintech developers cheered as their software integrated with the new payment system. And in Nairobi, small-scale exporters began signing up to test the platform within hours of its release. But behind the applause lies something deeper, a sense of vindication. For years, Africa's attempts to create its own payment systems were dismissed as unrealistic. Too fragmented, too risky, too dependent on external systems, the experts said. Yet here it is working tested and led entirely by Africans. It's not just a platform, it's a message that Africa no longer wants to be a customer in someone else's system. It wants to be the architect of its own. And in a world reshaped by tariffs, trade wars, and sanctions, that message carries weight. Because what COMESA is doing today could very well determine the shape of tomorrow's global economy. The applause in Africa had barely faded before the echo of resistance arrived from Washington. As headlines across Nairobi and Lusaka celebrated a new dawn of digital independence, news outlets in the United States carried a different tone. Within 48 hours of the COMESA announcement, President Donald Trump was asked during a White House briefing about Africa's plan to bypass the dollar. His reply was cold, almost surgical. Any nation that undermines the global currency system is taking a dangerous path, and it will face consequences. It was a warning not just to governments, but to an entire continent daring to challenge a century-old financial order. Across Africa, that statement landed like thunder. Political analysts saw it for what it was: a declaration of economic battle. And yet, instead of retreating, the response from the region was astonishingly calm, even proud. Kenyan commentators called it the first digital non-aligned movement. In Zambia, business owners painted slogans on their shops: "Trade free, trade African." President William Ruto doubled down. In a televised address, he stated, "We are not rebelling, we are reforming. We want fairness, not permission." Those words became the heartbeat of the movement. The COMESA platform was no longer just about payments. It was becoming a symbol of resistance, a peaceful rebellion fought not with armies, but with technology. For decades, Western powers had warned that economic sovereignty would isolate Africa. Now the opposite seemed to be happening. Cooperation among African nations was deepening faster than anyone had predicted. In Malawi and Zambia, local banks began adapting to the new digital interface. In Kenya, fintech companies saw a spike in investor interest. Across the border in Tanzania, civic groups hosted public forums on how digital money could shield African economies from currency shocks caused by U.S. interest rate hikes. Still, not everyone was celebrating. International lenders, including the IMF and the World Bank, began releasing subtle statements about the risks of untested systems. Behind diplomatic language lay a clear message: slow down. But the tone in Africa had changed. For the first time, leaders weren't asking for permission. They were asking for results. And while COMESA leaders met to discuss expansion, whispers of wider participation spread the economic community of West African states. ECOWAS and the Sahel Alliance, Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger were reportedly studying similar systems. A few experts even suggested that if COMESA succeeds, Africa could move toward a continental digital settlement currency rivaling SWIFT and Western payment networks. That's when the story truly reached its climax, when Africa's quiet economic project became a political earthquake. At the U.S. State Department, internal memos warned of a creeping loss of dollar influence in the global South. On social media, African voices fired back, reminding Washington that the dollar's dominance was built on the very systems that had drained Africa's resources for generations. And as if to punctuate this shift, a viral video surfaced from Ouagadougou. Burkina Faso's transitional president, Ibrahim Traoré, speaking at a youth forum, said, "If a farmer in Zambia must use the dollar to sell maize to Malawi, then we are not free. The day we trade in our own currency is the day Africa stands tall again." That single clip, shared millions of times, crystallized what COMESA had started. The digital payment platform was no longer a technical experiment, it was a movement, a defiant whisper that had become a roar. Across the continent, murals appeared in markets and schools: 3% our freedom tax. People understood what that number meant. It was the proof that Africa could trade with itself cheaper and faster without asking for permission from anyone. And as the United States hardened its rhetoric, Africa's response remained remarkably unified, calm, determined, and unyielding. The continent had found something far stronger than anger: clarity. When the dust of political noise settled, what remained were stories, small, human, and deeply revealing. In Lilongwe, a young tailor named Martha Firi opened her phone and received a payment from a customer across the Zambian border instantly. No foreign bank approvals, no hidden fees. For her, it wasn't just about saving money, It was about dignity. For years, she said we worked, but our money went through banks we never saw in countries we've never been. Now it comes straight to us. That sense of ownership, of taking back control, is spreading quietly across Eastern and Southern Africa. Thousands of small traders, farmers, and artisans are realizing that this digital payment platform doesn't just connect nations, it connects people. Economically, the results have been immediate and tangible. Transaction costs have dropped from 10 to 30% to under 3%, freeing millions of dollars that used to vanish into foreign transaction chains. Cross-border trade, once dominated by multinational intermediaries, is slowly returning to African hands. For the first time, local banks are reporting a surge in intra-African payments, and new fintech startups are emerging run by young programmers from Nairobi to Lusaka. But the political consequences are even more profound. The COMESA initiative has sparked a continental conversation about sovereignty, not just territorial, but monetary. Governments are beginning to ask, why should our economies rise and fall with decisions made by the U.S. Federal Reserve? Why should Africa's trade routes depend on systems that were never designed for African realities? Kenya's President William Ruto, buoyed by public support, announced that Nairobi would host the first African Digital Trade Summit next spring. The goal to invite other regional blocs ECOWAS, the Sahel Alliance, and SADC to align their systems into one continental framework. Observers call it the first blueprint for a digital African Union. Yet the path forward isn't without turbulence. International lenders are quietly reconsidering credit lines. Western analysts are warning of fragmentation risks. Some African opposition politicians even accuse their leaders of provoking Washington unnecessarily. But public sentiment tells another story. Across Kenya, Zambia, and Malawi, surveys show record-high approval for deeper African integration. The people understand what this means: a chance to finally escape the invisible cage of dependency. Culturally, too, something is shifting. Radio hosts in Lusaka speak of digital Pan-Africanism. Schools in Nairobi are adding modules on financial literacy and blockchain systems designed by African engineers. The conversation about independence, once confined to history books, has moved into marketplaces, classrooms, and community gatherings. In Burkina Faso, where President Ibrahim Traoré has championed the idea of economic sovereignty, the government has reportedly expressed interest in linking the Sahel region's payment systems with COMESA's platform. Independence is not a speech, Traoré once said. It's a system that allows your people to eat, trade, and dream without asking permission. And that is what this moment represents: not rebellion, but renewal. Not a break from the world, but a claim to belong to it on equal terms. For ordinary Africans, the revolution isn't happening in parliaments or on trading floors. It's happening in living rooms, on mobile phones, in the hands of women like Martha, where every digital transaction becomes an act of freedom. In Washington, the mood has shifted from disbelief to concern. At first, Africa's digital payment experiment seemed like another regional project, ambitious but harmless. But when analysts began to trace its implications, the numbers told a different story. If even half of Africa's 54 nations joined such systems, over $600 billion in annual trade could bypass the US dollar. That's not a headline, that's a paradigm shift. Inside the Treasury Department, advisors warned of a slow erosion of transactional influence. In plain words, the dollar's dominance, the foundation of America's global power, was being quietly challenged from the global south. Not by Russia or China, but by Africa. American commentators reacted in two ways. Some, mostly from Wall Street, sounded the alarm. If Africa walks away from the dollar, so will Latin America and Southeast Asia. Others, more reflective, admitted that perhaps this was long overdue. Maybe it's time to let Africa build its own systems, wrote an op-ed in The Atlantic, arguing that true partnership means respecting economic self-determination, not policing it. Still, the White House couldn't ignore the political signal. President Trump's statement, calling the initiative dangerous, reflected more than personal conviction, it reflected fear. For decades, American foreign policy has relied on financial leverage, sanctions, tariffs, and currency control. If new systems like COMESA's gain traction, that leverage weakens. Beyond the U.S., reactions have been mixed. In Brussels, EU officials have expressed interest in technical cooperation, but privately worry that Africa's growing financial independence could reduce Europe's market dominance. In Beijing, state media praised the move as a step toward multipolar trade, subtly suggesting that China could support Africa's digital payment infrastructure. And in Moscow, a Duma member declared Africa is doing what the Soviet Union once dreamed of, building a financial order free from imperial currency. But perhaps the most striking reaction came not from politicians, but from the public, especially the African diaspora in the United States and Europe. On social media, African Americans, Caribbeans, and first-generation immigrants flooded comment sections with pride and disbelief. One message went viral. "We marched for civil rights in the 60s. Now our brothers and sisters in Africa are fighting for financial rights and winning." It's a sentiment few in Washington anticipated, that Africa's economic defiance could resonate with Americans disillusioned by inequality and endless wars. Meanwhile, at the United Nations, quiet discussions have begun about creating a framework for regional currency settlements outside of Western control. The shift, once unthinkable, is now part of diplomatic reality. Back in Africa, leaders like Ibrahim Traoré see this not as confrontation, but correction. As he once said, "We do not reject America, we reject dependence." His words, replayed in American think tanks and European parliaments, summarize the moral challenge of our age. Can the West accept a world where power is shared, not owned? For the United States, the coming years will test whether it can evolve from dominator to partner. Because the truth is, Africa isn't turning away from the world. It's simply standing taller within it. The revolution we are witnessing did not begin with violence. It began with vision, and a question that every generation must ask: who controls our future? From Lusaka to Nairobi, from Ouagadougou to Lilongwe, that question now echoes through a continent that has decided to take its destiny back. The launch of Africa's digital payment system may seem technical, almost invisible to the untrained eye. But make no mistake, it represents something profound, a continent refusing to be defined by someone else's currency, someone else's permission, or someone else's fear. And yet revolutions of this kind do not come without resistance. History reminds us, when nations dare to rewrite the rules of money power trembles. Sanctions may follow, threats may come. But as President Ibrahim Traoré once said, freedom never arrives fully built. It is built by those who refuse to kneel. Today, a young woman in Zambia receives a payment from Kenya in seconds, no middleman, no Western bank, and she smiles. That smile is the quiet face of change. The world may not see her, but history will remember her. Because it is not governments alone that make revolutions. It is ordinary people who decide to stop waiting. The stakes are higher than ever. If Africa succeeds, it will not just free its markets, it will free its imagination. A continent once carved by empires will be coding its own destiny line by line, transaction by transaction. But if it fails, the old system will tighten its grip, and the dream of independence will fade into the silence of lost opportunity. So we must ask ourselves, what kind of world do we want to live in? One where freedom depends on permission, or one where every nation can stand trade and thrive on its own terms? If you believe that true sovereignty begins with economic justice, then you are already part of this story. Please share this video if you believe Africa's awakening deserves to be seen. And subscribe if you believe that truth, dignity, and independence still matter in a world built on illusion. Because one day when history looks back, it won't remember who held the world's currency, only who held the courage to change it.